कलगी वालड़े शहनशाह पिता मेरे चरना तेरियां ते नमस्कार सतगुर करके मेहर इस डुबदी जांदी नूं धक्का मार के लाना पार सतगुर दास्तान शहीदा दी लिखने नूं दास्तान शहीदा दी लिखने नूं दास आपदा होया त्यार सतगुर तोड़ चाड़ना अपनी मेहर करके नानक सिंह करे पुकार सतगुर
That was beautiful. Harpreet, for the launch of Navdeep's book in Delhi, Navdeep and Harpreet sort of worked together to create this bit of music based on one of the poems in the book that I'm going to ask Navdeep to read to begin with. Thank you all for coming. Just quickly to introduce you, Navdeep Suri, India's serving ambassador in the UAE. He's done a number of translations previously of his grandfather's work. This is the latest one. We'll talk about how the book was found. And with us is Justin Rowlatt, who used to be in India as the South Asia head for BBC and is now the most important person talking about or trying to prevent the earth from falling apart because he's head of environment here at the BBC in London. Thank you both very much for joining us. Navdeep, will you just read what Harpreet sang just to begin with, to put it into context?
So I think in the style of those times, the long poem, it starts with an invocation to Guru Gobind Singh, and that's the Satguru that Nanak Singh is referring to. And it starts with this: O Father mine, with thy turban plumed, I bow at thy feet, my divine Guru. So the writer is really saying, "Oh Guru, give me the strength to complete this task." And the task is to pen a portrait of those departed ones. Grant me the strength, my divine Guru, to remind my people across India, lest we forget their sacrifice, my divine Guru. To write the saga of our heroes such, your disciple is ready, my divine Guru. Do help me complete this mission of mine. Nanak Singh beseeches, O my divine Guru.
Wow. Now, this book itself, I mean, it's a bit of like a whodunit, right? I mean, Nanak Singh, Navdeep's grandfather, was at Jallianwala Bagh when the incident happened. And then he comes away from it and he pens this poem, and what happens?
So just, I think, a little bit of context on my grandfather, that he was 22 at this time when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. But he did go on to become Punjabi's most famous writer, wrote about 55 books in his lifetime. He'd gone to Jallianwala Bagh with two of his friends. Both died in the firing. He was knocked unconscious in the stampede, left for dead, walked away from there, and then wrote this poem. First published in May 1920, and soon thereafter banned by the Raj, and as far as we knew, all copies were confiscated, or most of them. And for the next 60 years in our family, we only knew, and that also we knew from our grandfather's autobiography, which was published in 1949, that he had written this long poem called Khuni Vaisakhi, but nobody had seen it. My father hadn't seen it, my uncles hadn't seen it, and they were publishing his books. In late 1979, my father comes across an essay in a Punjabi literary magazine called Jagriti, where some Professor K.S. Gupta has written at some length about Nanak Singh, my grandfather, as a poet. And it caught my father's attention because Nanak Singh was known as the novelist and not as a poet. And in the essay, he had quoted substantial excerpts from Khuni Vaisakhi. And so somebody like my father looks at it and says, how does he know about this? I've been looking for this book for the last 50 years, 40 years. And so he calls up the editor of the magazine and says, I want to be able to contact this Professor Gupta who has written this essay. And so my mom, who was also a lecturer in Punjabi, they go to his house and start talking to him. And he has this further story that Gupta's grandfather was a great bibliophile, used to buy everything that he could lay his hands on. And so he, in a small place called Muktsar in his house, when he had passed on, they found gunny sacks of books that he had left. And so when they moved home to Amritsar, and Gupta was rifling through this, because he himself was a lecturer in Punjabi language at a college in Amritsar, he looks at this Khuni Vaisakhi and says, oh my God, this is something rare and unusual, because this is, I've been teaching Nanak Singh's books and I've never seen this before. And so he writes then that essay. And then my father and he collaborate to first publish this Khuni Vaisakhi after a gap of 60 years in 1980. But nobody's really interested at that point of time because we were still sometime short of the centenary, I guess.
Justin, you both are linked together. Grandfather, your great-grandfather was Sir Sidney Rowlatt, who actually penned what then became the Rowlatt Act, which led to perhaps the beginnings of a really strong movement for independence. When you were in India, you visited Amritsar at some point and you went there. Tell us about what happened when you first walked into Jallianwala Bagh.
For people who don't understand the story, so the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened on the 13th of April 1919, obviously the festival was on, but it was also there was a protest against this act that my great grandfather wrote. So there was this kind of strong kind of family link to the massacre in a very uncomfortable way, and actually prompted by the BBC, who encouraged me to go, because I'd been slightly wary of kind of actually directly engaging with my family history while I was in India for kind of obvious reasons. And they said, hey, it was 2017, so the anniversary of independence, and they were like, hey, you've got a connection here. Why don't you do something looking at British Indian attitudes to Britain? And hey, what a clever idea! Why don't we get you to go back to Jallianwala Bagh? Which I bought. I mean, I clearly knew that this was what they were doing. But so I did go back, and to be honest, I didn't expect to feel a strong connection. I expected it to be a kind of abstract experience. You go in and you know that something awful's happened there, but you don't feel it. And when you first walk in, I mean, the garden, it wasn't a garden at the time of the massacre, it was an area of wasteland, and it's now been manicured to the point where you have topiary British soldiers, which are kind of, frankly, slightly comical. And so you walk in and you're sort of distanced from it. But then as I walked round with a guy called S.K. Mukherjee, whose father was there during the massacre, and who originally, he campaigned...
Ducked behind the stage.
He ducked behind the stage, and he campaigned to have the garden preserved because there was pressure by the British to to clear it up, build on it, get rid of it, because it was the scene of such a kind of a horrific kind of indictment of the empire. And walking with him and going around and seeing the bullet holes and stuff, gradually I became really powerfully emotional to the point where and it was actually, you could hear it in my voice when I did the radio report. I became actually upset and cried. And I was quite surprised that he wasn't surprised at all by this, S.K. Mukherjee. And he said it's actually very common for British people, even people without a direct connection to the massacre, to feel that sense of, I guess, kind of partially responsibility. We'll come on to that whole sense of responsibility later, I'm sure, but the connection and the, you know, and the scale of what happened and the horror of what happened when you see the geography of the garden, which is enclosed, no people couldn't go anywhere, and the British troops had come in and opened fire without warning and shot 1,650 rounds into this very dense 15, 20,000 people. You know, you realise the degree to which this was, you know, shooting fish in a barrel, really.
And in a place with no exit whatsoever. Navdeep, you've sort of been brought up in and around this place. Your grandfather himself was unlettered, and he was a Hindu, and he converted to Sikhism. Will you tell us a little bit about your childhood and your memories of Nanak Singh, and what made him what he was, which is, you know, the greatest writer in Punjabi?
Well, we grew up in his shadow. Our old home was very close to the Golden Temple, very close to the Jallianwala Bagh, and so it was part of the family ritual to go across to the Golden Temple every other day, and you know, and we'd mostly go straight past Jallianwala Bagh. There was no real consciousness about it, even in our family at that time. But my childhood memories of growing up in Amritsar with our grandfather, and then he moved on to a small village very close to the present border with Pakistan, was gathering besides him and urging him to tell us stories. And he was this really saintly, pious figure, always dressed in immaculate white, flowing white beard, always a little smile on his face, and happy to oblige the kids. Please, happy to oblige the kids whenever we would request him to tell us a story. And in a sense, you know, given his background as somebody who grew up in Peshawar, spent many of his early years there, was orphaned at the age of 9 or 10, and you know, when he used to be asked, so how far did you study? He would say, well, you could consider me a 4th grade pass or a 5th grade fail. You know, you take your pick. And it's funny because afterwards, more than 50 people ended up doing PhDs on his writings. He was drifting in his early years. He had a penchant for verse, and so he was popular at parties with his friends, but really drifting, not a lot of money, trying to make a living. When he came into contact with a Sikh spiritual leader in the Gurdwara in Peshawar, and under his influence, he converted. He was born as Hansraj and converted and took the name Nanak Singh. And then he applied his penchant for verse to write, when he was still barely 20, the first sort of booklet called Satgur Mahima, which were hymns in praise of the Gurus. And that became such a runaway bestseller that he got the the title of Pai Nanak Singh, Bhai being a sort of a title for those who have done particular service to the religion. And I think that's interesting because when we were trying to find the original book, and we managed to find the cover, and this is sort of the cover of the 1920 edition. What it says is Pai Nanak Singh Karta Satgur Mahima. So the writer is Pai Nanak Singh, one who wrote Satgur Mahima, which was his claim to fame when he was 22 years old.
Wow. Justin, when S.K. Mukherjee greeted you, he sort of, you know, he greeted you with a smile and you were a little surprised. And what did he say?
Well, I said, I mean, it was, by the end, it was quite apparent that he didn't feel any kind of animosity towards me at all, had welcomed me in and shown me around very kind of, you know, generously. And I said, you know, do you not feel any kind of anger towards me? Because the whole point was to explore this idea of whether or not, you know, people felt angry towards, you know, people like me who are connected to these kind of sins of empire. And he said, no, you feel remorse, so I don't feel any anger towards you. And that universally was the attitude that I found throughout India.
But you also talked about Gandhi and this being the first, perhaps, nail in many ways.
Well, that was Trushar Gandhi who said that. So as part of this, I decided to meet up with Gandhi's grandson, great-grandson, Trushar Gandhi, and he was. I'll quote what he says because he was fantastic.
Just written an essay for the book at my request. So
very cleverly, very shrewdly, he asked me to write an essay, which is which complements the work really, really well. And so I met Trushar Gandhi in
Teen Murti.
Yeah, Teen Murti Gandhi's old house in Delhi, and underneath a kind of tree. It was high summer, very hot. I was expecting him to be a little bit kind of standoffish and not too glad to meet, this guy who was the grandson of this kind of, effectively, I guess, in a way, a kind of, well, certainly an enemy of kind of India, I guess many would regard him as. And he said to me, the beauty of the Rowlatt Act. He said, I appreciate your grandfather's role to provide the first nail in the coffin of the empire. He said, laughing. And it was a brilliantly backhanded compliment, obviously. So I asked him to kind of explain, and he said, well, the beauty of the Rowlatt Act was that he didn't have to be a spin doctor to make people understand that it was unjust. It was so transparently malicious in intent that he could use it to create anger, to create resentment, and then channel it towards the kind of protest he wanted it to be a peaceful protest, because of course he used the Rowlatt Act as the basis for his first I can never pronounce it right. It's
Satyagraha.
So it was the first really big campaign that Gandhi used to mobilise the entire population, crucially, to unite Muslims and Hindus in opposition to the British. And it was that, Satyagraha that culminated in the massacre.
We'll come back to the act, but
okay.
Navdeep, Nanak Singh was influenced by Gandhi. Was he part of the freedom struggle? How did he land up in jail?
So I think the fact of being present in Jallianwala Bagh when he was 22 had a major influence on him. Until then, he basically wrote religious poems, and thereafter, virtually all of his writing, starting with Khuni Vaisakhi, is very nationalist. He participated in one of these campaigns to free the Sikh Gurudwaras from the control of British appointed managers, the Mahants, and he went to jail for that. And in jail, he met another prisoner who was influential and who had been able to bring in a trunk load of books into the jail, and most of these were novels by Munshi Premchand. And my grandfather didn't even know Hindi properly, but managed to read many of those.
Munshi Premchand is one of the great writers in Hindi in India.
And so he read his novels while in jail, and there was probably a flash of light, and he realized that this is what I really need to do with my life, to write novels that would reform society and which would speak of independence. And so many of his early novels, his first one was something called Matrai Ma, the Stepmother, in 1923. But then on, many of the novels that he wrote were really aimed at social reform, women's empowerment, superstition, the excessive power of the clergy on people, etc., etc., until the partition came. And then he wrote the searing set of 4 novels, which were really on the horrors of the partition.
And he also set up a printing press.
This was in his early days when he was still looking for what to do. In fact, this particular book has been self-published in a sense. So he set up a printing press, but printing presses were dangerous when the Rowlatt Act was in force because these were seen as seditious. And so
they're still seen as seditious. So.
So you had to be really careful about what you publish. And the practice, therefore, in those times was that the owners of printing presses would have a proxy owner, so that if somebody had to go to jail, it would be the proxy who would go to jail and not the owner himself. So my grandfather was talked into this by his friend who gave him the loan for the press.
3,000 rupees.
3,000 rupees, which was quite a sum in those days, to establish this press and earn a living. So they managed to get a proxy. And sure enough, the press was raided a few months later, and the proxy went to jail. And my grandfather was so horrified that this guy was newly married, is now in jail because of him. He said, I will continue to pay you the 25 rupees per month that we were supposed to pay you for your services till you are, as long as you're in jail. But he sold the press and paid off the debt, and that was the end of it.
Wow. Justin, give us a setting of what this act was. I mean, your great-grandfather, in fact, at various points of time, while putting together or trying to understand what the problems of, well, what we would call terrorism today, he went across the length and breadth of the country. And what was the setting in which he was asked to do this?
So yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and the extent to which his work in India informed the decisions that were made in terms of the both. So he was asked to chair a committee into sedition in India in 1917, and asked to travel. So he left.
So this is just, remember, after the First World War.
During the First World War, yeah.
And where India really played an enormous amount, a huge role with all of their troops going out to fight for the empire.
So like 1.3 million Indians fought on behalf of the British, and I think 750,000 were injured or killed, 73,000 were killed. So huge commitment by India. And at the same time, you know, the troops had left India, so the troops who were there kind of, you know, controlling India on the behalf of the empire had left. So there was this kind of vacuum of power in India, vacuum of kind of authority. So we'd passed an Emergency Powers Act with really draconian control over India. It suspended basic civil liberties and allowed, you know, trial without jury for offences related to sedition, related to anything that would undermine the British powers in India. So that was the background, and so he was asked to go out and investigate what was happening. Prior to the First World War, there'd been a whole upswelling of nationalist independence activism, which associated with kind of terrorism. So bombs had been thrown at the Viceroy and exploded bizarrely with shrapnel of gramophone needles, which, you know, burst the vice-regal eardrum, if I remember rightly, and he was injured. But, you know, this was just the biggest example of one of these attacks. So there'd been a whole series of attacks, and there was anxiety in the British government that there was this growing kind of ferment in India and this issue of sedition. And so his job was to go in and look at sedition with a view to introducing legislation after the end of the First World War. But what is interesting is that in parallel, the British government, Montagu and Chelmsford, the then Viceroy, were looking at ways, they recognising the Indian contribution and that the nature of government in India really wasn't sustainable in the post-World War, First World War environment. You know, that there had to be a nod towards self-government. We're looking at introducing reforms, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms that were to become the Government of India Act 1990. You don't need this much detail. But basically, so on the one hand, there was a reform saying more Indians need to be involved directly in government. We need more Indian representation. On the other hand, there was this initiative to go out and kind of try and work out what legislation was needed to kind of police India, and it's two completely contradictory activities. So my grandfather kind of turns up late 1917, early 1918. I love this. This is the committee, the report that he produced, the Sedition Committee report, price 1 rupee. It was actually very widely disseminated in India and translated into Urdu because they wanted people to read this. Because essentially, and this is what's interesting, and this is where and we'll come on to this, run into some conflict with other members of my family, the older members of my family. Because what's interesting about this is that it's essentially a catalogue of all sorts of crimes, from kind of burglary to political assassination, you know, jury rigging, but all these things which are all drawn together as if they're all part of the same revolutionary movement in India. And there's a big question about whether that really is accurate. And at the same time, this report, interestingly, contains absolutely no reflection on the justice of the cause that all these people were fighting for. There's no reflection on whether or not, hold on a second, maybe these guys have got a point, you know. Maybe the way to diffuse this anger, you know, is to give more, power to Indians, some self-government. There's none of that in there. Now, I suspect, and I say this in my article, I suspect that he's a civil servant effectively in his role with the Sedition Committee, and I suspect he was told, you know, these are the parameters of what you do, and
he was a good bureaucrat.
He was a very good civil servant.
Point of law. Well, it's a law that we still continue to suffer under. But let's go back to the poetry for a second.
Just a point on this, because just then I had a private conversation, and he shared with me that there even today some folks
No, we're
in...
going to come to that
We'll
later.
come to
I think
that.
we're going to come to that
All right.
later.
Okay.
Navdeep, this dirge that, and I call it a dirge, this dirge that Nanak Singh wrote, which you saw. So the first time that he sent me the manuscript, I was a little skeptical because, you know, when you try and, as you know, translate poetry from one language to the other, it's the meter, it's the form, it's the nuance, all of that is virtually impossible to do. And yet, when I started reading this for the first time, you know, it just completely blew me away because it's set into context because of the way the dirge is written. It gives you the background of what happened. It puts you into the present situation of the actual act in Jallianwala Bagh, and then it takes you forward. It tells you what happened as an after effect. And one of the most brilliant pieces of ballad or poetry, as you may have it. Navdeep, your grandfather sort of literally wrote it in segments and sections, setting the scene. Will you read out a little portion from it, and then let's come back to the conversation?
So I think, let me read out the one where the firing actually, when General Dyer arrives at the Bagh. 5:30 sharp, the clock had struck. Thousands gathered in the Bagh, my friends. Leaders came to lament the nation's woes, taking turns to speak out loud, my friends. Voiced grievance, hardship, anger, sorrow, saying no one listens to us, my friends. What can we do? What options left? Can't see any ray of light, my friends. Those words forlorn, they barely voiced, came soldiers thundering down, my friends. At Dyer's command, those Gurkha troops gathered in a formation tight, my friends. Under tyrant's orders, they opened fire straight into innocent hearts, my friends. And fire and fire and fire they did. Some thousands of bullets were shot, my friends. Like searing hail, they felled our youth. A tempest not seen before, my friends. Riddled chests and bodies slid to the ground, each one a target large, my friends. Smoke rose, haunting cries for help did rend the sky. Smoke rose from smoldering guns, my friends. Just a sip of water was all they sought. Valiant youth lay dying in the dust, my friends. And then it goes on. A fortunate few somehow survived, while most died then and there, my friends. Some ran with bullets ripping their chest. Others caught the bullet, stumbling to their painful end, my friends. Others caught the bullet while running away, dropping lifeless in awkward heaps, my friends. In minutes, the Bagh so strewn with corpses, none knew just who was who, my friends. Many of them did look like Sikhs, amid Hindus and Muslims plenty, my friends. In prime of their youth, our brave hearts lay, gasping for one last breath, my friends. Long hair lay matted in blood and grime. In slumber deep, they sleep, my friends. Says Nanak Singh, who knows their state, but God, the one and only, my friends.
And now the two things from this particular verse that I'd love you to comment on for our guests. One is he talks about, you know, no one hears our words and we're being silenced. Set the context into why the gathering happened and what had happened the previous day, etc., and the procession across the bridge. And also, if you can tell us a little bit about where was Nanak Singh himself when this happened?
So, you know, the remarkable thing about this poem, now 100 years old, is that it's partly a poem, but partly a piece of contemporaneous history, and somebody who was there at that point of time narrating a sequence of events. And I was talking to Kim Wagner yesterday, that with the depth of his research into the events, I had an interest in trying to establish the historicity and how much of poetic license did my grandfather take with the narrative. And I found that pretty much 90% of what he described, actually what he described is 100% accurate. The only thing that I observed was what he didn't write about, which was the
We can
rights.
come on to, I don't know if you want to come on to that later.
But just to complete this thought, so there was a sequence of events that on the 30th of March, Mahatma Gandhi gave out a call for hartal, or a general strike throughout India, which was to be done the next week, on Sunday the 6th of April. And that hartal was observed in Amritsar.
Hartal is a strike.
And as in many other cities. And then on the 9th of April was Ram Navami. And Ram Navami was always celebrated with a lot of gusto in Amritsar, but it was predominantly a Hindu festival. And what I found remarkable is, and again corroborated subsequently by other accounts, is the show of Hindu-Muslim Sikh unity that was on display during Ram Navami. And if I may, there's a very interesting passage that speaks about that show of unity.
Don't read too much, otherwise they won't buy the book.
All right.
Just a bit.
Hindus and Muslims, they gathered together to rejoice at a festival, oh my friends. Brotherhood conveyed by Muslims that day. Beyond incredible it was, my friends. A festival of Hindus, though it was, Muslims made it just their own, my friends. And it goes on to say how they drank water from the same glass and sat down to have their meals together and so on. And as a result of this show of unity, which the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar and the Commissioner saw as very threatening, because obviously with that policy of divide and rule. So both the leaders in Amritsar, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu, a Cambridge-educated Muslim lawyer, and Dr. Satyapal, a Hindu doctor, were both arrested on the 10th of April. And there's a very nice narrative about how they were arrested and spirited away to an unknown place by the police. And then on the 10th, in response to their arrest, the people gather together and they have one objective: to go to the civil lines area out of the walled city and deliver a petition to the Deputy Commissioner to release the leaders. And to stop them from crossing the bridge, there's firing on them. That's April 10. And April 11, there's a funeral then. And there are remarkable, sort of very visual scenes of that funeral where they are all going together. And then that takes you to April 12, where they're saying, okay, leaders have been arrested. Rowlatt Act has still come into place. What do we do next? So on April 12, they decide that 13th April, let's all get together at Jallianwala Bagh and to see whether we can deliver a message to the rulers.
Justin, the Rowlatt Act itself, in all its deviousness, tell us a little bit about the Act and what happened and the passage of the Act and why did it become, because a version of it was already in play during the war. And so yet when it comes back into the Legislative Assembly, all the Indians, which is 23 or 24 of them, vote against it.
I just give a little bit of background, because I was kind of very curious to kind of research a bit deeper into the family history of my Uncle Richard, who we'll come back to later, who isn't he? My Uncle Richard had collected together the family letters, and it's quite a trove, you know, and it's the letters, and he wrote, you know, of course in that era people wrote these fabulous letters, and he's travelling on a boat, so there's all this stuff on the boat. He had nothing else to do except play deck quoits or whatever they do and write letters, so he, you know, there's a kind of huge amount of stuff, and I went through, read, I mean, page after page of this stuff, and there is absolutely nothing, virtually, couple of little gems, but absolutely nothing on the substance of what he was doing, which I think is in itself quite interesting and speaks of, as we said earlier, the fact that he was this great, very diligent civil servant and wasn't going to do anything to kind of threaten his masters. But there are a couple of really key things that suggest that he knows what that hint at what he thinks is happening in India. So at one stage he goes to Delhi on this it's basically northern India. He travels across, arrives in Mumbai. Most of the work's done in Kolkata, but he does go to Delhi. New Delhi hadn't been built yet, so he goes out in some car to go and see New Delhi, and he says, "We had driven out to see New Delhi, where they're going to build a vast official city with a vice-regal lodge to which Buckingham Palace will be a cottage, residences and offices for all the government, houses for native chiefs, etc., etc. It covers a square mile or two at least and has a processional road as long as the Long Walk at Windsor." And this is the key bit. He says, "There have been 7 cities at Delhi, and all have perished with the folk that build them. The ruins are all here, and here we go, and build an 8th just when our show is tottering." However, it was a very jolly afternoon, he says. But, you know, here he is, he completely knows the game's up for the British. So this is kind of 1917, they're building this new city. He's like, oh, this is nonsense. You know, we know we're on our way out. And yet then he pens this incredibly repressive legislation. And let me just come to a second. This is the bit I was really pleased that I found. Because there is a hint in the letters that of something which, for example, Kim Wagner does really well in his book, which is that obviously he went out, and there's a great quote from Kim Wagner, which I'll read in a moment, that he goes out with this specific intention of writing a committee report that is designed to deliver the legislation that he then writes. So he gets on a train. He's on a train now from Bombay to Calcutta. He arrives in Bombay, over to Calcutta, and he's boyishly excited to discover that he has an entire carriage to himself, because, of course, he was this, you know, servant of empire and given all the kind of fabulous luxury. He describes it really a sort of small salon with a perfectly comfortable couch to sprawl on, he says. To complete my splendour, he continues, one of the governor's attendants in a khaki and red uniform, a fine red turban, and the monogram and coronet of the governor embroidered on his chest is travelling in a neighbouring compartment as my servant as far as Calcutta. So obviously enjoying the kind of luxuries of empire. He describes watching the scenery go by, etc., etc. Then he goes to the dining car to eat and meets up with two Englishmen he describes them of good position. By the way, he says to his wife, I think they guessed my errand. On leaving, I gave them my card and I said I expected they'd hear my name and that I should be lucky if they didn't, meaning that I expected to be well abused before I left India. Now, in Calcutta was where they actually did the work of writing the sedition report, so he's already expecting to be abused. So I think clearly they had a fairly good idea of what they wanted to put into the law.
All insecure governments and dictators tend to bring about draconian acts and laws as the Rowlatt Act. What is it in today's day and age that people still take from this and sort of pursue it? And Navdeep, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but why is it that bureaucrats like Rowlatt, or the Rowlatts of today as well, when they're told to bend, they actually grovel and
hold on a second, Sanjoy.
Yeah.
Should I go first? I mean, what do we learn from? I think there is a very clear message from Amritsar, a very painful message that was learnt by the British, which is that if you don't recognise the legitimate calls for self-government in a country like India, and this might apply to, states, within nations, but if you don't listen to justified claims for self-government, then, the consequences will be very bad. Had we compromised, instead of passing the Rowlatt Act, had there been a generous act of compromise, India would have got independence, but possibly not with the violence that we saw at Amritsar. I think there is a very strong lesson, and that is listen when people have justified complaints in your government, in your governance. Listen to them and hear their complaint.
Is there a legitimate reason or an argument for the British government to apologise, as it's being bandied around?
That's a huge. I mean, I don't know if you want to do that now, but I mean, I'm very happy. Kim Wagner has thought very deeply. He's written, so Kim Wagner is a historian who wrote an absolutely fabulous book on Amritsar, which was published on the anniversary, and this was a kind of... So what do I... No, just to put the context why I quote him. He argues that there shouldn't be an apology, and actually I agree with him, because I think if you apologise for one outrage, and clearly this was an outrage, and it was something that Britain should feel deeply ashamed of. If you apologise for one outrage, it kind of suggests that was the sin of empire. We apologise for Amritsar. The rest of it was okay. What Britain needs to do is recognise, that the whole process of colonisation and imperialism, imposed horrible, damage and discomfort and horrors upon the people who were colonised, and it needs to think much more deeply about it. And it's incredibly timely moment to think about these things, because if you think underlying, and I hate to bring this up because this must come up in so many panels, you know what's coming, Brexit. If you think about Brexit and
it's called karma.
What motivates? No, but what motivates? But if you think about what motivates people who argue for no deal, push them about what they think it is that makes them think that Britain will be okay on its own, will be able to stand on its own, and it's because they think we're special. They think there is something exceptional about Britain, and it's rooted, and I think if you dig into that, it's rooted in our history of empire, in the fact that we used to run the world, so of course we'll be all right. So there is it's not direct, and the way the British feel about the empire is very complicated. People don't often talk about it, but I think behind the instinct that we will be okay on our own is this idea that we are a uniquely exceptional people, and it's rooted in our idea of empire. And the fact is, we do not teach people in Britain about what the real history of empire was. And so I think Kim is absolutely right. Don't apologise for Amritsar, but recognise, the awful history of British Empire and teach our children about it.
Pulling ourselves back from the brink. Let's go back to the poem. Now, tell me, in the translation itself, how difficult was it? And I know in a car with Javed Akhtar, we were having this big conversation about rhyme or not rhyme, nuance, adaptation.
Well, when I started on this process, there's a little backstory. I actually looked at it about 3 years back also and picked up the book and said, no way, I can't do it. I don't understand poetry. I don't understand a single thing about rhyming and so on. And this is beyond me. And then last year when we were in Amritsar, my parents sort of said, why don't you give it another shot and try it? And so I started asking people who know more about poetry than I do, how does one go about this kind of thing? How important is it to maintain the rhyme? Initially, when I said I can't do it, some of the advice I was getting from friends and family was, oh, just do it in free verse. And so I was in this process of trying to educate myself. Javed Akhtar Saab was in Dubai for an event, and we were riding together in the car, and I showed him something. And
Javed Akhtar is a poet and lyricist, very eminent from India.
Very eminent, and I started talking to him. And I started reading up about it, including translations of poetry. And somewhere I came across this line by Robert Frost that translating without verse is a bit like playing tennis without a net. You can do it, but it's really not fair to the original, and that you are not abiding by the constraints of rhyme and meter that they were there in the original. So I think largely driven by that and some of the other reading, I decided that I had to try and capture the cadence of the original. Otherwise, it is too much of a disservice to the author. But not realizing that when you decide to go into rhyme while translating, you've lost 90% of the vocabulary that is potentially available to you to express the same thoughts. And so, I maybe at a couple of places I ended up creating devices that would enable me to get over that particular hurdle, and hopefully it works.
And the nuance was because the Punjabi nuance is so rooted in the earth, and English doesn't necessarily sort of translate or is not necessarily doesn't adapt that kind of earthiness.
I'm going to leave it to the readers to determine whether some of the pain or the raw passion or emotion comes through in the translation. Some places I think I've been able to do reasonable justice. Other places I struggled. I guess that's a process that you have to go through. But even today, if I had to go over to it again, I can't really come up with many brighter ideas of how to address some of those most troublesome passages. But what I found was that there was also, I guess that's a creative process, that there were areas that I was completely stuck on. And particularly towards the end of the poem are these small letters that have been written by people to the British government saying, recognize our plight, help us, look at us. And I felt I just couldn't do it. Until one fine Saturday morning, I sat on the computer and postcards of pain was how it came through, and it just fell into place.
What is it with Indian diplomats who are always so prolific and articulate and write so many books?
I think we were talking earlier about the responsibilities of civil servants and the reports that they are asked to do. So I guess we get attuned to the idea of writing fiction.
Just going back again to the act of sedition, and that sort of continues to haunt not just India, but many nation states across the world. In your view, what is an instrument that can possibly be used by governments which go away from sedition, from the whole concept of sedition? I mean, in that age, any kind of act against the crown was seen as sedition, which is actually, for us, our freedom struggle. Similarly, in many parts of the world today, or even in India, where they're fighting for a cause or B cause, that continues to be a really problematic space. So how do you view that?
Yeah, obviously any challenge to the authority of a government is always going to be difficult for governments to deal with. I mean, inherently. And as a measure of kind of just how draconian the act was, even owning a seditious newspaper, even being found in possession of what the British considered a seditious newspaper, you could be imprisoned for up to 2 years without trial and without appeal, which was Gandhi's kind of great kind of banner for his opposition to the act. It is uniquely difficult, and we see governments around the world struggling with exactly this, in the face of kind of all sorts of different kind of terrorist threats. Trying to deal with it, and arguably it's more difficult now than it was then, because you've got, social media. You see almost every day a story about, how do we regulate social media when it's radicalizing people in one way or another. So I think it's a very difficult, and governments are, have to be very careful to protect the rights of free speech and the rights of their citizens, whilst obviously at the same time, and every government has to be, they have a duty to protect us from these kind of threats, and there is of course an overlap between those two contradictory demands that are made upon them.
Does media have a role, and what is media's role in this, especially in today's day and age where in the post-truth world there is so much of the other that media has also subscribed to, if not been very much party in putting out?
I mean, look, media's, I'm talking in my capacity as a BBC journalist. Media's role is to kind of, explore these issues through the stories that we report, and discuss some of these tensions. Not ever, obviously, to prescribe legislation, but it's our role to kind of, illuminate and kind of elucidate these kind of issues, I guess. I don't think we have a more active role than that.
Well, one of the roles I think media must have is to ensure that what they put out has a validity and has a base of truth. And unfortunately, today media, not just back home or here or in America, tends to be looking at truth in a very different way than was the traditional aspect of truth.
Yeah, I mean that is, obviously, in the world of, the free world, the anarchic world of the internet, that is true, and that's what. But if you look at the way that people consume media, they do recognise that there are brands which are associated with impartiality or objective reporting, like obviously the BBC. I would suggest is one of them. The New York Times is another. And our traffic through our websites has increased quite dramatically as politics has become more contestable. Brexit here, Trump in America. So there is a kind of, which you could argue is people searching, for areas, for places that they can find something which does give them something closer to, something where they understand that, there is an effort to deliver something that approaches an objective truth.
Navdeep, in those days, media was different, and Nanak Singh in many ways wrote this particular dirge or ballad to get it out and get the pain of what happened there out. Tell us a little bit about how that sort of played out, and was he able to, what happened once the poem was published? Did it get that kind of play, or was it immediately under the act of sedition sort of?
There's nothing that we know about it. As I said, for most of us, the poem was gone, lost for 60 years. We are not aware of any impact that it made when it was published. It certainly didn't make any significant impact when it was republished in 1980. And I think it's only now, with in the context of the translation and the centenary and the greater awareness and interest that people have in what happened 100 years ago, that some of that message is going through. But when you read the poem in its entirety, there are at least 5 or 6 different sections where he clearly says that he's writing this for posterity, for us to remember the sacrifices of those who gave up so much for our freedom, and he wanted us to retain that message. Part of the tragedy is that even in Amritsar city itself, we are so complacent about it. We really don't bother to read our own history.
Everybody says that messages come out in a particular time. Do you think this was the right setting and the right time, and that's why it's found the kind of resonance across the world?
I think so. Maybe 5 years back or 5 years later, it may not have received the same attention that it has today.
Do you feel, 2 seconds, do you feel you have been able to pay tribute to your grandfather in doing this?
It's deeply satisfying. Some of the reviews that have come up, some of the emails, letters that come have been coming. Day before yesterday, I got an email from somebody in Bangalore saying that his father, 92-year-old Kannada writer, a Sahitya Academy Award winner himself, has read the translation and wishes to translate it into Kannada so that people can be aware. So for me, that's the ultimate satisfaction.
And Justin, apart from marrying B and feeling redeemed, do you feel redeemed?
I don't know if I found redemption. My wife's sitting at the front here. I don't know if I found redemption through me, but I do want to, because we didn't do this the last time we did this. I do want to read, because my uncle Richard's response to my coverage of our family's role in Amrit. So just to show you that there's still people who perhaps don't have such an enlightened, and I think it is quite relevant here. So he wrote this email to me, to the entire, you'll see, to the entire family and the BBC. He says, we're all impressed by Justin Rowlatt's reports from India, Afghanistan and Pakistan. But in a piece broadcast on the BBC Radio 4 Today programme on Monday the 14th of August, he committed an appalling gaffe in which he impugned the family honour, insulted the memory of my grandfather, slurred that of my father, displayed a lapse of journalistic standards, and professed an ignorance of his own family history, of which I am the guardian as the family archivist. I have rebuked him publicly on BBC Facebook, have pointed out his error in a private email, and would leave it there, except that the matter concerns the reputation of M.K. Gandhi himself. Briefly, the Mahatma launched his all-India career with a blood-stained campaign based on an irresponsible lie, namely that Sir Sidney Rowlatt, my grandfather, was responsible in some way for repressive legislation, which beggars belief. It's called the Rowlatt Act.
Can you just hold up the book just for that?
Yeah.
Just for that. Just for the thing.
Yeah.
Love to take questions. Maybe in clusters, so one here. Sure, I'll do them in clusters. So,
this is to you, Justin. I believe that there is still a degree of arrogance in British attitude in terms of not being willing to apologize and say sorry. A genuinely delivered apology, apology that is meant, has huge healing power. And I mean, this is all over. What's called Windrush generation, etc., etc.
Hold the answer.
Hold it.
So I would like
Young
your
lady.
comments on that.
Yeah. No, behind. And then we'll come back to her. And one right at the back, and I'll come back to you at the end. Go ahead.
Hi, so this question's to Justin. You spoke about Britain's unwillingness to acknowledge the evils of, its colonial empire and refusal to teach colonial history. So will this change in the near future with growing critical voices? And also, who is responsible for setting the school history curriculum?
Michael,
Okay,
go.
just hold on. And one last one at the back, right at the back.
Similar to that, first of all, Navneet, I was very pleased to hear you read your grandfather's history. I had the privilege of being born and taught in Indiana, read some of his poems, okay? So it's quite refreshing. Secondly, for Justin, we've had 75th anniversary of the World War celebrations. Now, in all the BBC coverage, it all said so many millions of people died. Nowhere, not even one person at any stage said that majority of people who died at that time were Indians. Okay?
I'm not sure it was the majority, but a lot of
Okay,
people.
so let's take these three questions
sorry,
and then I'll come back to Salim.
Sorry, I plead to BBC, really, if you can take it back. When we celebrate these kind of things or commemorate, we actually mention that the people who died were the cannon fodder. Thank you.
Yeah.
So 3 questions: education from Pratham.
They're all
apology.
related. They're all related. I think and I think the constellation of questions there around the British attitude to its imperial history. We did do the apology and why I don't think an apology is appropriate. And I think the answer lies in your question, which was about, when are we going to teach imperial history? The fact that we haven't engaged with imperial history suggests to me, I think, that we probably aren't, there probably isn't a huge appetite within Britain to teach that kind of history. We seem absolutely obsessed with the interwar period. And I don't understand it because
And the Tudors.
and yeah, exactly. Kind of, these obviously the interwar period is really important, but we should do more. I agree. There should be a much more formal tribute. It was a D-Day celebration, not the whole Second World War, but there should be tribute to Indian soldiers who fell there, exactly as there should be for the other nationalities. And you're right.
Except
that's
I suppose in a sense India was part of the colony and therefore acknowledged. But one here, one Salil.
One over here, yes, Salil.
Thank you. Firstly, I just want to say a big thank you to Jaipur Literature Festival for bringing the 3 of you together. I think it's a masterstroke.
Well, the masterstroke, to be fair, was Navdeep's,
Well,
who had done this wonderful translation and then kind of.
yes, my principal question is, moving things forward, I'm very much in tune with what all of you have said. Now, moving things forward, the British government does seem immovable on the subject of an apology, but I do wonder with the royal family, bearing in mind that they strive to do things that are best for sort of Britain PLC, and I'm aware that aside from it being, in my view, the right thing, an apology, I'm aware it is an invisible barrier to optimum trade relations at a time when Britain can ill afford it. And I would expect that Her Majesty and Prince Charles would be receptive to this perspective. I just wonder how you would see, moving forward, is there something that perhaps the royal family could do to make a general apology with a specific inclusion of Jallianwala Bagh?
Okay.
Well, the poor royal family doesn't have a prime minister to advise them right now, but you should wait for that one. Salil, can we go to Salil first and then come here? Sorry. One last.
5 minutes.
Yeah, this is for Navdeep actually. Does India expect an apology? That's one question. And maybe, Justin, if you have a thought on Nigel Biggar's project on the ethics of empire, which is, I think, the other dominant theme in Britain right now, that let's forget about this apology business. We have a lot to be proud of.
And one last question here, Mani, just on your right. And we'll get the answers and we'll run away.
I was wondering if you could talk about Rudyard Kipling's comment on the Jallianwala Bagh firing and his defense of Dyer. He even contributed money for Dyer's fund.
And for his grave.
So, on Salil's question, I came here with a clear mind that I will not get into the apology issue because I'm an Indian diplomat serving in a third country. So, God forbid
He's
I should.
instructed. He's not allowed to talk.
I'll just stay clear of that.
Would it make it easier for us with trade? Do you think if Britain made it?
I think it's a bit vain to think that matters of commerce are going to impact on healing of consciences. I think that's
responding to her point. That there might be practical.
Conscience and commerce, what they share C, but that's about it. And you had talked about Rudyard Kipling comment.
I don't think it's surprising that Rudyard Kipling supported Dyer, really. Lots of British people supported Dyer. I mean, what's interesting about Kim Wagner's book is it sets it in the historical context and says, that what Dyer did was actually because of this fear of a repeat of 1857 of the so-called, what British people call the Indian Mutiny, the First War of Independence. There was this, abiding terror that one day, because of course there were very few British troops, would rise up and would murder British people. And the only thing missing from this is the fact that on the 10th of April,
yes.
The 13th is the massacre. On the 10th of April, there was this riot throughout Amritsar in which 5 British people were killed, and most outrageously of all, Miss Sherwood with her bicycle was beaten. So there was this, and that was the first
But
time.
also rescued and held.
She
in
was
a shop.
rescued, and taken to the fort and nursed back to health. But it was considered an insult to the authority of Britain. It was, I think, the first time since 1857 that Europeans, as they call themselves, British people, had been killed by Indians in India in that kind of way. So it was, that in itself was a reason for people to feel very anxious.
Well, you can read about all the other humiliation that was that was done at that period of time. It's an absolutely brilliant piece of work.
It's lovely,
Navdeep,
yeah.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Justin, thank you. They will be signing books just behind the big stage. Mani, sorry for being late. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the festival.